So my paper is titled Thomistic Hylomorphism and the Metaphysics of Race. Abstract. This paper will develop in two parts. First, I will utilize the works of St. Thomas Aquinas and the philosopher Aristotle to develop an account of race given a Thomistic hylomorphic view of the human person, a position that understands race in the human person as an inseparable or necessary accident that is generationally derived and individually individuated. And second, I will situate the Thomistic hylomorphic account of race in the contemporary debate and show how the Thomistic hylomorphic account can assist in the race conversation by delineating what we are talking about in the race debate and shed light on how we talk about race. As a brief caveat, this work will not present Thomas Aquinas' account on race. Admittedly, it is rather anachronistic to talk about the philosophical thought of anyone before the 16th century in connection with race. Furthermore, one would be hard-pressed to find a systematic treatment or a discussion on race in Thomas's writings. Nevertheless, perhaps his hylomorphic account concerning the human person can provide a metaphysic that can be relevant to the contemporary debate on race, and a Thomistic hylomorphic account of race can be situated in the current debate. A Thomistic hylomorphic account of race. According to Thomistic hylomorphism, the person is a body-soul composite composed of both matter and a substantial form, i.e. the human soul. In Thomas's words, body and soul are not two actually existing substances, but one actually existing substance is made from them. For man's body is not actually the same while the soul is present and when the soul is absent, and it is the soul that makes it to be actual. Elsewhere, he states, man is not a mere soul, nor a mere body, but both soul and body. As Aquinas sees it, the relationship between the substantial form, i.e. the soul, and matter, i.e. the body, is one of inherence where the substantial form informs the matter. The soul as the substantial form is an individuated essence that makes the body a human body and informs, animates, develops, unifies, and grounds the body. The human soul is the internal metaphysical grounds of genuine internal relations, real functional entities, and the teleology within human bodily development. In sum, the soul as the substantial form of the body is what is responsible for guiding the growth and the physiological/morphological development of the body, along with providing the makeup of the body. Given this understanding of the human person, how are we to understand the concept of race in the human person? In developing a Thomistic hylomorphic metaphysics of race, there will be two principles that we've posited. The concept of race in the human person is to be understood as P1, generationally derived, that is hereditarily or biologically derived, and P2, it's individually individuated. So concerning principle 1, generationally derived, although Aristotle may not have had the contemporary understanding of race in mind when he discussed genera, perhaps it can be argued that his use of genera could carry a similar connotation in contemporary discourse. According to Aristotle, through generation, we can understand how one can reproduce their own genus or race. Aristotle posits a dual definition of genus, which is on the handout. The term genus or race is used, A, when there is a continuous generation of things of the same type. That is, as long as the human race exists, means as long as the generation of human beings is continuous. Or it could be used, B, of anything from which things derive their being as the prime mover of them into being. Thus, some are called Hellenes by race, and others Ionians, because some have Hellen and others Ion as their first ancestor. In Aristotle's first definition, what I call race A, according to Aquinas' interpretation, Aristotle is referring to the generation of the entire human race as a single species. This definition will be placed aside in this paper. In the second definition, what I call race B, which is of more importance to this discussion, Aristotle highlights the ancestorial or generational components in the generation of the individual human person's race. Aquinas writes, the term also designates that from which things are first brought into being. For it is in this way that some men are called Hellenes by race, and others Ionians, because the former comes from Hellen and the latter from Ion, as the one who begot them. Aristotle thus emphasizes the propagation of the human person's race, as defined as race B, by tracing the role of ancestorial generation. For example, Hellenes from Hellen and Ionians from Ion. And I believe an argument can be made that Aristotle would have also included one's geographical origin as a characteristic of race. For example, Ionians originate from Ionia. Thomas Aquinas, likewise, favoring the Aristotelian tradition, may have understood race B as generational in that members of the same race B share ancestry and likely the same geographical location. Furthermore, although Aquinas was not privy to what we now know concerning heredity, Aquinas was aware of morphological traits being passed down from parent to offspring. In his Summa, Thomas notes, "A man begets his likeness and species, but not the individual. Consequently, those things that pertain directly to the individual, such as personal actions and matters affecting them, are not transmitted by parents to their children. On the other hand, those things that concern the nature of the species are transmitted by parents to their children, unless there be a defect of nature. Thus a man with eyes begets a son having eyes, unless nature fails. And if nature be strong, even certain accidents of the individual pertaining to natural disposition are transmitted to the children. For example, fleetness of body, acuteness of intellect, and so forth." Though Aquinas does not explicitly mention skin color, which we may understand as a certain accident of the individual, Aquinas makes an explicit claim in De Malo. He says, "We need to note that a univocal begetter transmits the nature of his species to the begotten, and so all the accidents that result from the species. For example, as a human being begets a human being, so a being capable of laughter begets a being capable of laughter. And if the power of the begetter happens to be intense, he transmits his likeness to the begotten, even regarding individual accidents. But this is so regarding accidents that in some way belong to the body. For example, a light-skinned father usually begets a light-skinned son, and a tall father usually begets a tall son." Thus, Aquinas understood that certain accidental morphological traits, such as skin color, were passed down via generation, i.e., hereditarily or biologically. In other words, one's ancestorial generation, which leads to a determined sharing of hereditary morphological traits and perhaps a common geographical origin, distinguishes members of distinct races. Understood, again, race B. Now, principle 2, it's individually individuated. According to the second principle, although the morphological traits that are based on ancestry and geographical origin characterizes one's race, race is individuated in the individual. That is, Aquinas did not believe that there were white essences and black essences, or Hellenian essences or Ionian essences. Rather, there was one human essence, right? One human race, understood race A, and one human form that was common to all human persons. Nevertheless, given Aquinas' hylomorphic doctrine, race is to be understood as an individuated feature in the individual. Aquinas states, "We must take into consideration that matter is contracted by its form to a determinate species, as a substance belongs to a certain species, is contracted by a supervening accident to a determinate mode of being, for instance, man by whiteness. To clarify, the matter that is contracted by its form to a determinate species is the human species, with the substance being the human person. The individual human person is the one who possesses a supervening accidental property to determine a mode of being, for example, whiteness or blackness. An accidental feature is distinguished from a necessary feature in that to be an accidental feature of A is to be a non-foundational feature of A, while to be a necessary feature of A is to be a foundational feature of A. According to Aquinas, though being white and black may be a necessary feature of a swan or a crow, this is not the case in human beings. He states, man, as far as his species is concerned, is neither white nor black, nor is it a condition of his species that he should not be black or white. But blackness or whiteness is superadded to the man by other principles than those of his species. In other words, for Aquinas, although possessing a rational soul or possessing a human body are necessary features of the essence of human personhood, whether a person is white or black or red, etc., is not a necessary feature of the human race, but an accidental, non-necessary property. Again, additional accidental properties may include eye color, hair color, or being 6 foot tall. Thus, we can conclude accidental morphological traits, like skin color, are non-necessary features of the human species. In disputed questions on the soul, however, Aquinas distinguishes different types of accidents, namely proper accidents, inseparable accidents, and separable accidents. So that's proper, inseparable, and separable. He writes, there are three genera of accidents. Some are caused by the principles of the species and are called proper accidents. For example, risibility in man. Others are caused by the principle of the individual, and this class is spoken of in two ways. First, those that have a permanent cause in their subject, for example, masculine and feminine, and other things of this kind, and these are called inseparable accidents. Secondly, those that do not have a permanent cause in their subject, such as to sit and to walk, and these are called separable accidents. Now, no accident of any kind ever constitutes part of the essence of a thing, and thus an accident is never found in a thing's definition. Hence, we understand the essence of a thing without thinking of any of its accidents. Given Aquinas' taxonomy, how are we to classify the accidental property of skin color? I argue an individual's skin color best fits under inseparable accidents. For as discussed, skin color would not be a proper accident, since whiteness or blackness is not a characteristic of the human species as a whole, and it seems like one's skin color has a permanent cause in the human person, unlike being seated or walking. Another way to classify the morphological trait of skin color is to classify it as a necessary accident. That is, as a necessary accident, although a particular skin color is not a necessary feature of the human person, that is, it is not necessary for the human essence, nevertheless, that one has a particular skin color is necessary, in the sense that because the essence of the human body involves bodily integration, both body and soul, the physical body must necessarily take on a certain pigmentation. But whether that pigmentation is white, black, brown, or red, however, is an accidental feature grounded in heredity. In sum, how are we to understand the concept of race in the human person given Thomistic hylomorphism? Race, understood as race B, is derived through ancestorial generation, which may involve a common geographic origin, and the morphological features that characterize a particular race are necessary or inseparable accidents that are individuated in the individual. Thomistic hylomorphism in the contemporary discussion on race. Albert Atkins notes the debate over race often relies on and begins with how one answers the definitional question, how should race be defined? In other words, what is race? Naomi Zach provides 5 prominent definitions for the term race in the contemporary intellectual discourse. R1, race is biologically inherited, and it causes both physical, cultural, and moral traits that can be objectively compared in terms of human worth. R2, race is biologically inherited, but it causes only physical traits. R3, race is a matter of superficial physical appearance, mainly skin color. R4, race is a cultural artifact based on biology, even though the biological differences between societal or cultural races are arbitrary and unscientific. R5, race is a social construction that reflects history, politics, and shared social traditions among dominant and subordinate human groups, each of which shares interlocking intergenerational lines of family descent. If my interpretation of Aquinas is correct, given a Thomistic hylomorphic account, race in the human person should be understood as either R3, R4, or a blend of the two definitions. Race B is, all things considered, an accidental, non-necessary property that affects one's physical appearance, and these properties are delimited by hereditary and generational constraints. R1 and R2 would be rejected due to their implying the traditional racialist understanding of different races as biological kinds or essences. As Aristotle and Aquinas understood, there is one human race that makes up the species. That is, there are not white human essences and black human essences. Rather, there are human persons with the property of whiteness and human persons with the property of blackness. Likewise, R5 would be rejected due to there being a generational continuation that is rooted in genealogical ancestorial generation. Thus, race is not purely a social construct that reflects history, politics, and shared social traditions among dominant and subordinate arbitrary human groupings. Thus, the Thomistic hylomorphic account of race would reject both extremes of biological racial realism and racial limitivism. However, how is this Thomistic hylomorphic account of race in the human person relevant to the contemporary debate? That is, how is this Thomistic hylomorphic account relevant to the larger contemporary discussion concerning the concept of race in the present social and cultural context? Here, I will make a slight nuanced distinction between what we are talking about when we talk about race and how we talk about race in our current socio-cultural context. Admittedly, how we think and speak about race today, especially in the West, is socially and culturally charged. As Naomi Zach notes, through colonialism, global development, the adoption of individual racial identities, and behavioral and institutional practices that have harmed racial minorities, contemporary race talk cannot be had apart from taking into consideration the socio and cultural conception of race. Thus, as I introduce my Thomistic hylomorphic account of race, I will keep clear the distinction and posit that given a Thomistic hylomorphic conception of race, the what of race should be understood as a superficial biological reality, yet in our current socio-cultural context, how we speak about race is a serious socio-cultural reality. So first, race as a superficial biological reality. Michael Hardiman's minimalist conception of race, in my approximation, shares similarities with this Thomistic hylomorphic account. According to Hardiman, the minimalist concept of race, while rejecting the idea of intrinsic biological essences or normative important features, such as intelligence or worth, posits that races can be distinguished by differences in patterns of visible physical features, for example, skin color, hair texture, nose shape, and so on, corresponding to differences in geographical ancestry. However, as Hardiman argues, it is important that we distinguish the concept of race from mere skin color or other morphological traits. Although we can say skin color can function as a metonym for the full range of relevant physical features associated with race, not all morphological differences count as racial. For Hardiman to count as a racial trait, the innate, visible physical feature must be inherited, passed down biologically to offsprings from the parent. A visible physical trait must be heritable. Once we understand that the property of skin pigmentation is a necessary or inseparable accidental property, which does not define or determine the human essence, I believe we can adopt this minimalist concept of race. All things considered, the characteristics that make up racial traits are superficial biological realities not necessary to the human essence. The differences in skin color, hair texture, bone structure, nose shape, etc., are mere differences in ancestral generation which have no bearing on the human essence. Thus, on the one hand, racial categories are not to be viewed as robust biological categories in that races represent separate essences or kinds. On the other hand, race is neither a brute nor basic fact that is non-biological, nor simply non-existent, for there is a referent by which we make distinctions between different races. But race is also a serious socio-cultural reality. Nevertheless, while race is a superficial biological reality, how we talk of race in our current context is a serious socio-cultural reality. To clarify, race is not a purely socio-political or cultural construction rooted in the hierarchical structure that has no biological correlate. The biological differences, for example, racial morphological traits, between races are real, even if superficial when concerning the essence of human personhood. Yet I believe we cannot minimize the importance of understanding the socio-political and cultural reality of how we speak of race today. Admittedly, how we understand race and determine what racial traits are today has been affected by our socio-cultural order. The categorization of white people and white morphological traits, black people and black morphological traits, Asian people and Asian morphological traits, and so on, are unavoidable social realities given the way our world is. As a thought experiment, we can conceive of a possible world where all people have the same skin color, hair texture, eye color, and so on. In this world, would there be any morphological traits that would be considered a racial trait? Undoubtedly, all human persons would still possess a certain skin pigmentation, eye color, hair texture, etc. Nevertheless, in this possible world, it seems that these traits, though biologically grounded, would not be discussed in the terms we speak of them today. Perhaps here people may still be grouped by cultural, geographical, or ancestral origin, but race, as we typically refer to it today, would not serve as a classification. Given our current sociocultural context, race talk concerning common sense racial categorization and racial traits is an unavoidable and inevitable reality. In conclusion, as we consider the metaphysics of race, given this Thomistic hylomorphic account, the ontology of what we speak about when we talk about race are certain morphological traits that are necessary, inseparable accidental properties. However, this must be distinguished from how we often talk about race. Given our current socio-cultural context, how we speak of race in our everyday conversation concerning common sense racial categorization and racial morphological traits have been shaped and continue to shape the current discussion on race. Thus, while what we are talking about when we talk about race in the human person is a superficial biological reality that is generationally derived and individuated in the individual, when we talk about race, we should treat it as a serious socio-cultural reality. Now, since I've got some time, I do have a theoethical discourse on race, just based upon this position. Although Aquinas never discussed racism per se, his writings on love and hatred may be applicable to the sin of racism. Concerning the relationship between love and hatred, Aquinas writes, "Love consists in a certain agreement of the lover with the object loved, while hatred consists in a certain disagreement or dissonance. Now, we should consider in each thing what agrees with it before that which disagrees. Since a thing disagrees with another, through destroying or hindering that which agrees with it. Consequently, love must precede hatred, and nothing is hated save through being contrary to a suitable thing which is loved. And hence it is that very hatred is caused by love." Elsewhere, Aquinas states, "Hatred is opposed to love, so that hatred of a thing is evil, accordingly as the love of that thing is good. Now love is due to our neighbor in respect of what he holds from God, i.e. in respect of nature and grace. Men are not opposed to us in respect of the goods which they have received from God. Wherefore, in this respect, we should love them. But they are opposed to us insofar as they show hostility towards us, and this is sinful in them. In this respect, we should hate them, for we should hate in them the fact that they are hostile to us." Aquinas thus concludes that hatred is both caused by love and opposed to love. To make sense of this, we need to be reminded that Aquinas has in mind the eudaimonian understanding that the human will is directed towards the love of a perceived good, a basic love being the love towards oneself. He writes, "Every man has it instilled in him by nature to love his own life and whatever is directed thereto. Hatred, as both a passion and action, is directed towards that which threatens or obstructs a perceived good, i.e. an object of love. Thus, given this understanding, perhaps the sin of racism can be described as a misplaced or inordinate love for one's own race. For example, the will's inordinate love for self, causing the will to hate members of another race, often motivated by a misunderstanding of human nature and race. Racism may be rooted in the sin of vincible ignorance, ignorance of a matter that can be overcome and one is bound to know. If the cause of the sin of racism is ignorance, perhaps the solution is a proper understanding of the human person as created in the Imago Dei. The biblical creation narrative culminates with the claim that God created man in his own image. In the image of God, he created them, male and female, he created them. Although what is meant by the image of God is widely debated, the general consensus agrees that all human persons, regardless of gender, social status, race, or physical appearance, bears God's image and reflects the divine reality in some way. The creation of man was at the penultimate climax of God's creative activity, and the bearing of God's image is the basis of treating all people with equal dignity, respect, and value. Furthermore, we can argue that God, in his divine creativity, continues to freely create human beings of all races to display his glory, and Christians can look forward to one day beholding a great multitude that no one can number, from every nation, from all tribes and peoples and languages, standing before the throne and before the Lamb. As Joshua Ferris notes, the fact is that God created a rich diversity of people who share universally and generally in humanity. Furthermore, this diversity has some role to play in God's redemptive plan for the church, where various expressions of worship, languages, customs, and rituals will contribute to the lively interaction of humans in the new kingdom. Admittedly, however, much work still needs to be done in evangelical scholarship concerning the philosophy and theology of race and race relations. As important as this topic is in contemporary life, especially church life, Daniel Hayes notes how evangelical, biblical, and theological scholarship, and I would include evangelical philosophical scholarship, has remained nearly silent on this issue. Moving forward in our contemporary social, political, and cultural context, I believe it is imperative for Christian philosophers and theologians to address the fundamental question, what is the human being? As Christian philosophers and theologians develop a robust metaphysical understanding of the human person and pursue the study of theological anthropology, the church will be equipped to address the sin of ignorance at the root of the problem of race and race relations that we currently face today. Thank you.